Thank you very much for your kind words. Actually, I'm extremely pleased. For me, it's my first invitation, so if I'm not too bad, maybe I will get a second one sometime. So thanks very much for being here. So I'm going to... I chose this title, Recovering from Maastricht, because I think that the difficulties we are experimenting today come back from Maastricht, and not just the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis was the trigger, but I think, well, it's always difficult to do some counterfactual analysis, but even without the global crisis, maybe we would have had a major crisis in the euro area. Nevertheless, I would not like to be too pessimistic. I think the US, it took several decades for the US to make monetary union. And so it's not so surprising that we have trials and errors as a start. So I will start with the Maastricht Doctrine. I think there were three pillars in this Maastricht Doctrine. The first one was policy assignment. So I will not say that there was no fiscal policy and that people disregarded fiscal policy. On the contrary, so we were in period of peace, of the great moderation. So the idea was that, well, the ECB would deal with symmetric shocks in the euro area, and then national governments would deal with idiosyncratic shocks. So there was no need for coordination, for instance, because, well, the tasks were well defined. So implicitly, this supposed no large shocks. It also relied on the Stability and Growth Pact that would work, actually, but also not so large shocks of the kind we've seen with the crisis, either at the country level or at the aggregate. We'll come back to that. The second pillar of the doctrine, in my view, was what I call the triple ban: no bailout, no monetization, and no debt restructuring. So if you take the three together, then there's not much to do if you have too much debt. And the idea was that the Stability and Growth Pact would avoid that we have to ask ourselves this question. And finally, this is something often forgotten, this was the idea of national supervision of the banks. So if you think about it now, it's a bit strange that the euro system creates central bank liquidity, money, central bank money, but it is the commercial banks that create the money supply. And as you know, the banknotes are a very small part of the money supply. So it's a bit strange that in a monetary union, more than 90% of the money supply is provided by banks that are regulated at national level. So this is, well, a bit strange. So the policy assignment failed at the country level and at the euro area level. At the country level, at the time where peripheral countries were willing to borrow, there was no lender any longer. So there's a sudden stop of capital inflows in these countries. You may argue that this is because they had borrowed too much before. It is right for the private sector, but it's not always right for the public sector. Look at Spain. Spain complied with the SGP while Germany was not in the 2000s. So Spain was a good fellow in the class, and nevertheless, at the time where it needed to borrow, it was difficult to do so. And we know that fiscal rules were too loose in the boom in 2000 and too strict in the crisis. But at the euro area also, there was a failure. And we know that the ECB, so it's 2009, not 19. So there were exceptional circumstances in 2009 where there was some fiscal impulse. There was a huge symmetric shock, negative symmetric shocks, and there was some coordination at that time, but then it failed. There was an aggregate fiscal contraction in 12-13, just at the time of the second dip, and later on the ECB was called for fiscal stimulation because we know now that the ECB alone cannot reach its target of 2% inflation or a bit less. So this is for policy assignment. And so we are rediscovering an old concept, which is the policy mix. the coordination between monetary and fiscal policy, which something we thought we had gotten rid of with the independence of the central bank. Now, the triple ban failed also. So, you know that economists love trilemma. No monetization, no bailout, no restructuring. It could work with the SGP, but the SGP failed. It could work with growth or inflation, because this is the most elegant way of getting out of debt overhang. It's through growth and inflation, but there is no growth, nor inflation any longer. So what did the euro area countries do during this period? Well, discreetly, a little bit of the three, with a little bit of temporary monetization in the case of Ireland. It's finished now, but it did happen. Some restructuring in the case of Greece, and some bailout in a sense. So, but this is not accepted. This is done, well, it is improvisation. Finally, bank surveillance failed. This has had, of course, a huge impact on debt sustainability assessment. So we had thought about off-balance sheets in terms of aging. If you look at EU publications, there was a lot about aging and off-balance sheet liabilities of the governments, but there was nothing about the banking sector. And we see that Ireland had a debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratio of 24% in 2007, and it increased to 120% in 12. So it's very impressive how a country with extremely low debt could just see its debt explode in a few years. So Paul talked about the doom loop, so this interconnection between the sovereign risk and the banking risk. I just wanted to add 2 points. The first, so the loop goes like that. There is a rise in sovereign risk. Then, because the bonds are in the asset side of the balance sheets of the banks, there is a depreciation of these assets. Hence, there is a loss for the bank or reduced profit. So there is reduced credit and reduced GDP then, which means that the sovereign debt becomes less sustainable, etc. What I wanted to add is that it's not just a solvency risk, and we saw in the case of Greece that it was also a liquidity risk because those bonds are used as collateral to get liquidity from the central bank. And you remember at that time, in 2015, I think, the ECB was raising the amount of ELA, the emergency liquidity assistance, given by the Bank of Greece every week or 2 weeks, just at a level to keep the banking sector afloat, because otherwise, if you have a liquidity crisis, whatever the solvency, the banking sector, so there's an incentive to reintroduce a national currency. Hence, there is a redomination risk, which is extremely toxic in the euro area. So I think this is very important. And we come back to that because this has to do with the lack of so-called safe assets. So on the top of these three flows, there was a lot of frivolity, and I will mention three. One was current account imbalances. So only Trichet was interested in that, it seems to. So all countries which were deeply hit by the crisis had a very large current account deficit just before the crisis. So they didn't fall in crisis by chance. They had large deficits just before. And it was unfortunate that only non-euro countries could receive assistance in case of crisis. This was a kind of very strange thing in the treaty. Now, on the side of the current account surpluses, a current account is an excess supply, so it contributes to low inflation and low interest rates. So there is here a lack of coordination of these imbalances. And of course, these imbalances in a monetary union are benign because it's a monetary union, so there is automatic financing through the target system. Fine enough, but in fact, people didn't care about target before the crisis, and then they became hysteric about it, whereas I think this is something that is absolutely normal functioning of a monetary union. It's just that if a country leaves, of course, it's a big issue because the country will no longer repay its target debt. The second frivolity was about the real interest rate. Probably you know this very well. The inflation convergence in 1997 was artificial, not least due to the Balassa-Samuelson effect, the fact that some countries with lower GDP per capita would experience higher inflation, but even in Ireland, which was already... So I remember a bit before the crisis, there was a moment where the Eurogroup tried to tell the Irish government, you are overheating, you should reduce the public spending or increase taxes or whatever. And the Irish government said two things. First, we are complying with the SGP, so there's no problem. Second, we are extremely small, so we cannot have a systemic impact on the euro area. So I think it was a big mistake at that time for the Eurogroup, for the European Council, not to insist on this, because of course when you have higher interest rates, then you can have negative real interest rates. When you have higher inflation, you can have negative real interest rates. This happens in many countries. And of course, a negative real interest rate is fantastic. The more you borrow, the richer you become. The third issue related to the other ones was the lack of coordination. The coordination is written in the treaty, but it was not taken seriously. There was these broad guidelines for policy, but nobody cared about that. Now we have the European semester, but it has proved quite weak so far. So what has changed since the crisis? Many things. I would just mention 4, because I think Paul covered already this. So emergency assistance is very important. Self-fulfilling crisis, the whatever it takes, that takes care of the bad equilibrium, the self-fulfilling crisis. The unconventional monetary policies, and the banking union, which is not complete so far. So what problems remain today? I think there are essentially 3. One is that financial markets are still fragile and fragmented. So banks in country A are still heavily exposed to public and private borrowers in country A. And I think in Germany it's the same as in Italy. Banks in Germany are heavily exposed to the German risk. So if there is no risk, it's okay, but at some point, things could change. So it is true that governments are no longer supposed to finance the banks, but the reverse is not true. So this makes banks and funding of the economy extremely vulnerable, and it would be safer for banks to hold a safe asset like the US Treasury bonds. So a safe asset whose value would not fall during a crisis, and this would be extremely stabilizing for the... So I think the Eurobond discussion has started very badly in the euro area because it was about mutualizing the risk. This is not about mutualizing the risk. There are many ways of doing otherwise. It's about stabilizing the banking sector. It's about stabilizing the financial sector. Second, inflation is too low, and the next crisis could be even worse. We need inflation. Why? Because we still need to carry out some relative price adjustments. And if you want a high debt country, a peripheral country, to reduce its prices relative to the other countries, you need to have an average inflation that is higher, because otherwise the risk is deflation. And if there is deflation, the debt will, so you have debt deflation, the debt will go out, which will fuel even lower inflation or more deflation, and so on. The monetary policy is not yet normalized, to say the least. Fiscal policies are still constrained by European rule on national politics. And there is a political divergence that is extremely toxic between creditor countries that blame the ECB and debtor countries that blame the SGP. So we need to make some reconversions between the two kinds of countries. And finally, the fundamental flaw is still there: no monetization, no bailout, no debt restructuring. So austerity cannot be the only game. And this leads me to the deflationary bias. Paul already said that only deficit countries had to adjust during the crisis, and this is true. If you think about the gold standard, in the gold standard, deficit countries needed to adjust because they would lose gold reserves. But the gold standard was abandoned for good reasons. And today we have the euro standard. So for the private sector, it's not too bad because deficit countries can still get funding from solvent banks through the target system. So the target system will allocate the liquidity where solvent banks need the liquidity. This is how a monetary union will function. So to the extent that the banks are still solvent, it's okay. But for the government cannot monetize the deficit. As Paul said, it's as if it were in foreign currency debt. There is a big constraint for the governments. So the deficit countries need to adjust. There's no constraint whatsoever for surplus countries. In the gold standard, surplus countries would accumulate gold and would experience inflation. And this would rebalance the current account. It's not the case in the euro standard. So there is a bias here that in a sense is even worse than in the gold standard. So you know that Keynes wanted to tax imbalances with the deficits or surpluses. It's like the polluter-payer principle. So we are not there, but there is a big issue there. So the macroeconomic imbalance procedure of the European Commission has largely failed. It's very complicated. It's not enough focused. There are many things that have nothing to do with the risk of a crisis. I always give this example of childcare or of a gender balance. I'm in favor of gender balance, but I don't think this is a trigger of a financial crisis. So I think we need to disentangle what is long-term growth and what is short and medium-term risks. And finally, I have come to the conclusion that we should maybe design simple rules of thumb, like wage growth should be the same as productivity growth on average, or current accounts should be between limits. And I'm not so sure that we cannot have an impact on current accounts. There is, of course, the public deficit, but it's also, for instance, in Germany, there is a lot of savings in the corporate sector. You can think about ways to transfer part of these savings to the households that may be more willing to consume it. So I'm not so sure that we can have no impact on the current account. Maybe it's for the discussion. So credit growth, should not be faster than GDP growth. So this is macroprudential policy, and this is an issue because we have a macroprudential policy framework that is completely separated from the European semester. So if I look at my country, for instance, country-specific recommendations for France in the chapter macroeconomic imbalances talk about many things except the main problem, which is corporate leverage that is going up very fast. Why? Because this is macroprudential. This is something else, the ECB and the national bodies. So today we have a window of opportunity with R lower than G, interest rates lower than growth. So how are we going to take this opportunity and to fight the deflationary bias we have? Is it at national level or is it at euro area level? So I show you, probably you are familiar here because I know that here that there are hot debates about investment. So this is the evolution of net capital stock for the total economy at constant prices in the Eurozone. So this is the aggregate Eurozone. And there is more or less a 200 billion fall compared to not even pre-crisis, to 2005. Okay, so there is a lack. The net capital stock has declined. It has not recovered from the crisis in the euro area, in level. I'm not talking in percent of GDP. In a way, a common budget could be a substitute for failed coordination. And this reminds me of the monetary union. The monetary union was introduced as a way to overcome the failed coordination of monetary policies within the European monetary system. The European monetary system, before the monetary union, it was kind of coordination of monetary policies with fixed exchange rates. And this ended with big crisis. In a sense, we have a European fiscal system today that doesn't work. And a way to overcome this would be to have a layer. I'm not saying that we should become a federal country, a layer of a common budget to overcome the impossibility to coordinate the fiscal policies. So then, if you want a budget, what for? And then there is a divergence between economists and politicians, my view. Economists tend to say that, well, what is specific to the euro area is, of course, the currency, the common currency. So, you know the distinction, stabilization, allocation, and redistribution. What is specific to the euro area, the need is stabilization, clearly. But the politicians don't really understand what is stabilization about. And it's extremely difficult. I had some hard work in trying to explain to several politicians that, well, we could have a budget that you don't touch during several years. Okay, you wait until there's a big crisis. And this is something extremely complicated for politicians. If they meet together, they want to spend. Of course, they want to spend. So how to make, so it's a big failure. I think the way the euro area budget has finished it's a big failure of us economists. We have not been able to explain it in a more convincing way. How to make our point, nevertheless, I think we need to combine the idea of stabilization with that of allocation. And we have today one possibility around the climate, and I will finish on that. The idea of a climate union, so this is something people are talking about. So what is different with climate is that we have joint commitments. This is the Paris Agreement. It's a commitment of the EU. Well, it's not the euro area, but at least it's the EU. So it doesn't matter whether the reduction in carbon emissions are done in Spain, Germany, or whatever country. What is important is that the EU fulfills the joint commitment. So this is very interesting because it's an invitation to break with the juste retour logic of the budgets. The EU high-level expert group on sustainable finance has evaluated the needed investment of about 177 billion euro per year, which is enormous. And if you come back to my graph about the 200 billion that is needed, we are in the same orders of magnitudes. Of course, and this is something people forget, we need absolutely a carbon price to do that. Otherwise, you pull public money or private money on something that will never carry a return. So you need a carbon price, and this is absolutely, it's impossible to think about a big push in terms of investment for climate for the energy transition without this carbon price, and also a convergence with the ETS market. So there is a need for kind of green Juncker plan or whatever you call it. As Blanchard said, there is a window of opportunity, but for investment, not for current spending, of course. And you could think of a package where the European Investment Bank, through the European Fund for Strategic Investment, could provide guarantees, like in the Juncker plan, and the EIB could issue bonds, and these bonds would be EU bonds, so kind of safe bonds. And of course, the ECB would be extremely pleased to buy these bonds because these are truly European bonds. They are not from national countries. And the whole market needs, and I will finish on that. One reason why we have so low interest rates has to do with the lack of safe assets. There are not enough safe assets, and there are less and less actually with the German debt going down. And everybody wants them. The central banks want to do QE. The banks want to fulfill their liquidity and capital requirements. So everybody wants these assets, and there are less and less, except in the US where there are more, but there is a question of whether they are really safe. The orders of magnitudes are not so absurd. Today, EIB bonds are only 500 billion of EIB, compared with national government debts, which is 10,000 billion. But the ECB QE is 2,600, so there's some room in between. So it's not to say that the ECB should, of course, invest in climate change. The ECB does its job with a mandate, an independent mandate of inflation. But if it needs to do some QE, it's better to buy European bonds than national bonds, especially since it has some limitation on a country-by-country basis. So I think this is something that could work, but again, we need to agree on a carbon price, which needs to be quite ambitious and common across the European Union, which is, of course, the thing that the politicians don't like. But at least in debtor countries, they love to spend. But if you tell them that they need also to impose a price of carbon emissions, it's much less enthusiastic. Thank you very much.